This is a precursor of something that's really big. This is going to be the century of electricity. Right now, it's about AI, but if you look at the long-term trends in things like robotics and electric vehicles, this is just the beginning of the demand growth that this industry is going to have to deal with.
There needs to be a bit of an adaptation from the utilities themselves on how to make this fair for the ratepayer.
Typically, chips have a 5-year life. When somebody buys a chip, they depreciate those over 5 years because they expect there will be a new technology and they will have to replace those chips. When an investor invests in a power plant, it's typically a 30-year life. And that is kind of the biggest mismatch between these two industries.
Welcome back to the Interchange Recharged. I'm Bridget Van Dorsten, and you may have noticed a new look. We've updated our show art, but the podcast itself hasn't changed. We'll still be bringing you the same great deep dives as we always do. Now, a few weeks ago, I talked with Bloom Energy about fuel cells as one of the solutions to the data center power demand needs. And today, I wanted to take a step back and look at the bigger picture, because it's not just about which technologies can deploy the fastest. It's also about a fundamental transformation and how the power business works in order to meet this level of demand. And so the level of demand growth that we've seen in the U.S., I mentioned on the last episode, 175 gigawatts of committed large load capacity. That is real, that is growing, and it is creating a timeline problem that the industry has never faced, which is that data centers can be built faster than the power infrastructure to supply them. And so this mismatch is forcing changes across the board in how utilities structure tariffs, how grid operators handle interconnection, how developers think about where and what to build. And it's revealing something interesting, which is that not all utilities are positioned equally to meet this moment. And so whether you're in a regulated market or a competitive one suddenly matters a lot. And today we're exploring what the transformation looks like in practice, the creative solutions, the new rules being tested, and the trade-offs that utilities are making, and what it all means for renewable developers that are trying to navigate this landscape. And to have this conversation today, I'm joined by Chris Seiple, Vice Chairman of Power Renewables at Wood Mackenzie, who has been analyzing how utilities and developers are navigating this transformation. Chris, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Bridget. Excited to be here.
Well, so Chris, you've been reporting on this for probably about a year now, where you first reported on this demand growth dilemma back in October 2024. What's changed since then? What's been happening?
I guess a couple things come to mind. The first thing that comes to mind is just the scale of the number of proposed projects and the amount of demand growth it entails has just continued to escalate with new announcements and new data centers every month. And it's really of a bigger scale than, we had ever envisioned really 2 years ago. And then I think the second thing is that, the industry has had about 2 years to kind of catch up to this surprise in demand growth. And so we're starting to get more color on what's working, what's not working, and where the biggest challenges lie.
The load growth that we've been seeing, as you mentioned this word surprise, does that mean that the utilities are surprised by this load growth that we've been seeing? What makes this load growth different from past demand growth?
Understanding the context in which this load growth has happened is a very important part of it. U.S. utilities have had no load growth over the past 15 years. Like literally the rate of demand growth in the U.S. power sector was about 0% per year. And nobody was really predicting that this demand growth was going to happen. And when you think about the planning that has to happen in the power market, right? Planning cycles are measured in like 5 to 10 year increments, not 0-year increments. And so all of a sudden you have this demand growth occurring, and utilities don't have a culture of being ready and prepared to deal with demand growth. The regulators that regulate them have not regulated them in a world that has demand growth. And so this has been kind of a big cultural change for the industry to go through. And it's also why it's such a big challenge, because nobody was really prepared for it. And it takes a lot of time to build out the infrastructure to accommodate this kind of demand growth.
So I can imagine then what is the right comparison to be made? Like a post-war boom, the crux of electrification itself on the grid?
There's two different parallels come to mind for me, or, analogies. One, a senior head of strategy at one of the electric utilities, and describing the situation at his electric utility, described it as, we are basically building an airplane while it's flying. That was how it felt within his organization, because this creates a lot of new challenges for the industry. But the other parallel that I look to for what is transpiring right now is that when we look back in history, the last time we can find that kind of the industry went through something like this was back in World War II. And so in 1939, at the start of World War II, all of a sudden an enormous amount of new electricity demand growth happened to support the manufacturing that was necessary for all the armaments to support a war. And again, it had that element of surprise. Nobody was anticipating that was going to happen. And it's also an interesting time period to look back to on kind of what transpired when that kind of surprise happened, because it's very similar in the sense that, meeting data center demand growth, the power artificial intelligence industry is one of the most important strategic imperatives for the United States. Also, it's not just data centers. There's also manufacturing growth, and reshoring manufacturing is another important strategic objective for the United States. So you have two really, really important political priorities where the power industry sits at the center, much as it did during World War II. And one of the things that we went back and looked at that period of time was that, there was a lot of innovation that came out of this kind of scarcity of power supplies. I mean, passive solar houses. The research on passive solar houses started during World War II as a way to free up electricity, energy efficiency, to free up electricity to be able to power manufacturing. And innovation is very difficult to predict, but I think this situation where we have a buyer who's willing to pay a lot for a product that they can't get enough of, which is electricity, combined with it being kind of a strategic priority for the United States as a whole, are kind of conditions that set us up for innovation. So it's a really exciting time.
I think that World War II example that you gave is really helpful to put this into perspective, not only in terms of demand growth, but also in terms of a strategy for the United States. And you mentioned that it's not just a strategy to support the demand center load growth in the U.S., but also reshoring some of the manufacturing. And I think something that I hear when I'm reading articles or when I'm talking to people is large loads. And it has me questioning, is this terminology new or is it newly prominent? And the question that I have for you is, what is the difference then between these large loads that are more traditional, like chip manufacturing, if you can call it traditional, even though it's been just the past couple of decades, or data centers? What's the difference between those large loads?
Yeah, there are historically some large loads in the United States. Example would be refining or a steel plant. But it has been a long time since we have built new refineries in the United States, or that we have built new steel plants. And oftentimes when those facilities were built, they were built with power generation supplies built at the site as well. That was typically how it was done. And what's different now, I think, is kind of the scale of the large load. Like some of these loads are much bigger than any refinery or steel plants have ever been. 1,000 megawatts. We have 1,000 megawatt data centers that are now under construction in a couple places, and it's not in the manufacturing loads are similarly of a very significant scale. I mean, Arizona Public Service has a chip manufacturing facility that is now up and operating and still expanding in its service territory that could grow to as much as 1,200 megawatts of demand. That's like the entire load of all of Colorado Springs, to kind of put that into perspective. And, I don't know that there's necessarily differences, though, in the challenges associated with serving these large loads, although they are being treated differently in some ways by regulators. And I think that's partly because of there's a I guess a perception that the manufacturing large loads will create a lot more jobs than data centers necessarily will. And I think that's part of the reason that they may be given some different treatment, on a political level.
Well, that's good to hear from a humanitarian perspective. But so there's not really too much of a difference between a chip manufacturing facility and a data center, apart from this regulatory difference, because they're both large scale facilities. But I think something that strikes me as a difference between large loads in general, whether it be data center or chip manufacturing, is how long it takes to build a data center versus how long it takes the power infrastructure to serve it, which is very different, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, that's a lot of the challenge for the industry right now. The companies that are building the data centers want to be able to get online as soon as possible. You can permit and build a data center within 2 years, whereas it's going to take you 5 years to build, to permit and build any of the generation associated with supplying that data center. And if you have to build transmission to also accommodate that, transmission can have even longer timelines than that.
And that's even with every technology, gas, renewables, nuclear, still there's this supply shortfall.
Yeah. There are a lot more renewable energy plants that have been under development for the past 5 years than other technologies. So the projects that are typically farthest along, that have the equipment ordered that they need and things like that, are renewable energy projects. So it is easier in the short term to bring renewable energy projects online just because there's a large pipeline of renewable energy projects. But if you're starting development on a new renewable energy project, developers are typically counting or expecting that it will take them 5 years to get that type of project up and running from the beginning of its life.
So there seems to be this timeline mismatch between supply and demand. And you mentioned innovation as being really important here. But I think even just taking a step back, all of this conversation is before we account for the risk that the demand might not materialize.
Even those closest to understanding how much compute will be required, like the hyperscalers or, the Metas and the Amazons and the ones that are experiencing the customer demand and closest to it, they don't really know how much compute they're actually going to need in 5 years. And so if they don't know how much compute they're going to need, it's very difficult for the industry to know how much power needs to be built. And, the risk that And there's risk on both sides. It could be that we don't build enough, and this kind of a shortage of compute manifests, and it could be the opposite, that we overbuild the data center industry. We overbuild the amount of power plants needed to serve it. And then there are questions about how, if that's the situation, how does that play out in the for investors and for customers of electric utilities.
Hyperscalers are planning 5 years ahead, and you have utilities and developers that are trying to build transmission infrastructure and supply that are looking at least 20 or 30 years down the road. And so we have this unprecedented amount of demand and this timeline mismatch. And so I can imagine that this is forcing changes in how utilities are actually operating. Which brings me to asking the question about what is the difference between a regulated utility and a deregulated market? Because I would think that matters for how utilities are able to respond to this demand boom, right?
First of all, that's a very important point that you just raised. And I just want to highlight the point you made. It's that when, typically chips have a 5-year life. When somebody buys a chip, they depreciate those over 5 years because they expect there will be a new technology and they will have to replace those chips. When an investor invests in a power plant, it's typically a 30-year life. Mm-hmm. And that is kind of the biggest mismatch between these two industries. Investors who are in companies who are investing for a 5-year life versus companies that have to invest for a 30-year life, and is kind of managing that risk that is, one of the biggest challenges. Coming to your question about regulated utilities, in the spring of last year, a colleague and I conducted, about 20 to 30 interviews with electric utilities and with data center developers who are working on building projects to see what was working, what's not working, and how is this driving change across the industry. And if we tie your 2 points together, the question of what's happening with regulated utilities and the question of innovation, there's a lot of interesting things happening. So, and to be more specific, it's not like regulated utilities. I'll be referring right now specifically to vertically integrated regulated utilities where the generation is regulated, the transmission is regulated, and the customer does not have a choice of who they purchase power from. And in those markets where you have utilities like that, utilities have really evolved a lot since they were surprised by this demand growth that started about 2 years ago. They have developed much more sophisticated large load interconnection processes, as one example. They have developed large load tariffs. Large load tariffs are a deviation from the way the power industry has worked since it started. Really, all the way back to Samuel Insull is the one who kind of came up with the model that has been used since the beginning of the industry, which is that you take the cost that an electric utility has and you basically average those costs across all of the customers that you're serving. And we're now deviating from that, where electric utilities are developing large load tariffs that work to specifically allocate the cost for the infrastructure that has to be built to serve a new data center to those data centers directly. And typically also under, terms that haven't existed before. Typically a data center is now having to sign a contract with a requirement for it to pay for this power for 10 to 15 years in the future. In many cases, whether or not it even needs that power. And, that's an effort to try to bridge this gap of companies who are investing in assets that have a 5-year life versus electric utilities who are investing in assets that have a much longer life period. There's more innovations to come back. I'm excited about the innovations. So,
well, let's talk about it more, but I want to break it down to your average Joe. So you're talking about tariffs. Everybody's looked at their electric bill. They know that they have a tariff from the utility, and then they also pay for the electricity that they use. So this innovation that you're talking about, where we're changing from the large load tariff to this other model that we haven't totally fleshed out yet. What is this, like a subscription model? How does this change my electric bill?
It's a really complicated question. Now, the way this could work, and let's talk about regulated states and deregulated states. If you lived in Pennsylvania, the price that you pay for electricity would be partly tied to changes in wholesale power market prices that are not regulated, one portion of your bill. So if we talk first about the completely regulated markets where your bill is set by this average cost of service type of rate making policy that I described that has governed the industry for over 100 years, if we had used prior practices, the power plants that are being built to serve data centers are much more expensive than the average rates customers are paying. And that is because the cost of building a power plant has doubled almost in the past. The cost of building a gas-fired power plant in particular has almost doubled over the past couple of years. And so under prior rate-making treatment, that cost would have not been assigned directly to the data center. It would have just been averaged across all customers. And because the cost of that new plant is higher than the rate you currently pay, everybody's rates would be going up. So these tariffs are being meant to try to allocate those, costs directly to the data centers to mitigate the level of price increases that customers would face. In some cases, utilities are getting, really creative. There's one utility in the Midwest that actually developed a tariff and got permission from its regulatory commission to essentially charge as much as it could get for that power from the data center. And the revenues it was able to get were higher than the costs of actually serving that data center. And so they took some of that excess revenue and actually used it to reduce the rates of existing customers. But utilities have a lot of factors besides just data centers that are increasing their cost. And so this is becoming a highly politicized issue across the country, even in states that have done this work to develop tariffs to allocate the cost directly to the data center customers. And, utilities, because of more severe weather, are having to spend a lot more to harden their system so it can withstand that weather. That's resulting in price increases for customers. The cost of the transformer that somebody has that they see outside their in their neighborhood that, drops the voltage down so the power can come into somebody's house. That little piece of equipment is twice as expensive as what it was 5 years ago. So there's just been all of these kind of factors driving cost inflation that are also causing prices to increase. But it's very easy to pick the data centers as a scapegoat for the cost increases, even where there's efforts to deal with this.
I wanted to ask you about this this model that you've said that the utilities are implementing in order to push that cost back onto the data centers. What is that? Does that have a name?
We just refer to it as large load tariffs.
Okay, so large load tariffs. Those are really the utilities addressing the ratepayer concerns without any kind of regulatory intervention.
Utilities have to work really closely with their regulators at introducing things like this. So this is, and this has become politically contentious in some areas, but this is this is really a negotiation between groups representing existing customers, the regulators, the utilities, and the data center companies themselves.
And it seems like in regulated markets where you have that close relationship between the utility and regulatory scrutiny, these political relationships are actually working in the utility's favor in order to kind of make it more fair for the ratepayer. Would you say that that's right?
Just take the example of natural gas in the United States. Natural gas demand is going to increase substantially over the next decade as we begin to export more LNG. When we export more LNG, that is likely going to cause natural gas prices to be higher than they would be otherwise. But we don't say to the natural gas company to the company that's exporting the natural gas, you actually need to pay a higher price than every other customer because of the demand growth that you're creating. It's a really unique situation. It's a unique industry. It's regulated at a state level. And I think these are kind of, the reality of the politics of it. There would be a lot greater opposition to data center development if everybody's electricity prices were going up. And so, this is a way to deal with that. But an economist would say there's lots of arguments around whether or not this is the best policy or not.
And so the way that utilities have been able to implement this in regulated markets, could that ever be replicated, or would there be a desire to replicate it in a deregulated market? I mean, what is the fundamental difference, maybe starting here first, between regulated and deregulated markets?
Yeah, so there's really two big differences at work here that, the large load growth has made apparent. We have about 20 years of experience now with deregulated electricity markets in Europe and the US. And this is the first time in deregulated electricity markets we've had to deal with demand growth on this scale in so many places, I think. And the nature of the demand growth is, as we've discussed, unique in that the demand growth can be added to the system very quickly. And so there's really two differences that are becoming apparent. The first is the regulated electric utilities have found a way and a mechanism to make sure all of the cost of this incremental demand growth is being paid for by the data centers, which ameliorates political pressure that they would face otherwise. In the deregulated markets, the way it should work in theory is prices have to rise to a level that incents new investment, and because current prices aren't high enough to incent that investment, it suggests that prices need to rise substantially. And in a deregulated market where the price that all consumers pay is set by the single price of power in a competitive power market, prices have to rise in theory for all of the existing customers. And that is a political problem. It's a problem for politicians and it's a, in a country where affordability of everything is a big political issue, this is another challenge for consumers to have to deal with, another source of rate pressure for them. And so the deregulated markets don't really have a good mechanism for segregating the cost increases associated with this new load directly to them, which means it's likely to force some type of change in the deregulated electricity markets, because this is such a big political problem. The second difference, too, that has become apparent is that because the regulated utilities look at their system on an integrated basis, and by looking at what I mean by that is they look at generation investment, they look at transmission investment, they look at distribution investment, they look at the way across all three of those to kind of serve their customers in a least cost way. And so as they've gotten more sophisticated in dealing with data center demand, those who control the whole system are able to kind of have a conversation with a data center company that nobody's really equipped to have that same conversation in the deregulated markets. Like the utility can look at their system and say, okay, the hours when I'm in, and there's an example of a utility did this in the Southwest United States. The hours that I am most constrained on my system when I don't have enough power plants are between the hours of 11 o'clock at night and 7 o'clock in the morning in the wintertime. So if you data center want to connect to my system and you can give me some interruptibility, you find a way to curtail your demand during some of those hours, I don't need to build a new power plant to serve you. I can serve you from the existing investment that I have, and I can get you online 4 years earlier. In the deregulated market, there's really nobody to have that conversation with about how to optimize what I'm doing. That optimization happens through Adam Smith's invisible hand and price signals. And so it's a lot, and so it's a lot more complicated to do, especially when you have multiple people all trying to connect to the grid and different actors making decisions on transmission investment and things like that. It's just not working as well.
So I think it's logical then, based on what you've just said, that the advantage that there is from being vertically integrated, from being in touch with those political levers, from owning the equipment, from having the transmission and distribution, you have more control over your system. You are able to find where you can lose some weight or lose some responsibility somewhere along your supply chain in order to move more quickly. Would you say that that's the right takeaway?
Yeah. I mean, Bridget, this is a very hard conversation for me. So I got into the electric power industry because I was a student in 1992, to date myself. And I had two professors who came up from Washington, D.C., to teach a class on U.S. energy policy. And the Energy Policy Act of 1992, which deregulated the wholesale power market, was being debated. And I said, wow, this looks like a super exciting industry to be in. And because this industry is being deregulated and going to go through so much change, and change that I thought would be beneficial, and change that in many cases has been beneficial. And I've lived a career where I've seen the evolution of deregulated markets. And there's a lot of things I think that have happened that would not have happened were it not for having deregulated electricity markets. I think it did really bring a lot of efficiency. And there were investment decisions that investors made that were bad investment decisions in the past. when utilities made bad investment decisions, often it was the customers who bore the brunt of that. Instead, it was like the investors. So, there's been innovations. There's been a lot of benefits that come, but that was a long-winded way to answer your question, to say that right now it does appear that there are certain benefits to the vertically integrated, regulated electric market model that we had before deregulation in serving some of these customers. I would balance that by saying, in the deregulated markets, because they're not working particularly well, a lot of what we're seeing is large scale data center development, like 1,000 megawatt or 5,000 megawatt campuses get proposed, almost seeking to build like a mini non-regulated utility system behind it to serve it. And we may see the benefits of the deregulated market model come out of that, right? Just in a different way than was originally envisioned. And we may see, innovation comes that helps find ways to deliver that electric power, more reliably and more efficiently as a result.
And I think based on what you've shared, it sounds like for this problem, we need all the tools in the toolkit. And it's not just going to be one type of data center, one state, one utility, or one innovation that a utility can bring to play, one piece of policy, one piece of technology. It's going to be a mix of absolutely everything. And I think something that you mentioned as well is what the regulated markets are an example of how the regulated markets are attempting to change and kind of changing this tariff structure. But how is it that and you mentioned that the deregulated markets are on the verge of, something's got to give. They've got to change in order to keep attracting this new demand growth to their markets. What do you feel like is going to give? What is going to be that change for the deregulated market in order to meet the demand?
Yeah, I mean, the hard thing is there's no easy answers to this question. No easy answers on how to kind of like solve the dilemma and, keep the market intact. I do think what's going to, part of what's going to happen is we are going to find ways in a deregulated market to introduce new regulation and have less of a deregulated market, to try to do our best to segregate the prices that the new large loads have to pay for adding the investment. And, if you're an investor in the sector and you're looking at buying an existing asset, that's something that you really have to think about. Like, how is that going to affect the value of existing assets in the market? Because power markets have not actually historically, and are likely not to in the future, behave like typical commodity markets do because of this propensity for, intervention in the markets. So I think one part of it will be around market rule changes. I think the second part of it is what I just alluded to, kind of the effort to find ways to do this with either, maybe call it like a light interconnection, and a lot of kind of behind the meter or co-located generation resources serving the demand. It also, if you look at where a lot of the data center capacity is proposed, in deregulated markets, it's in PJM, the Mid-Atlantic United States, and it's in Texas. And those are also two regions that have, a lot of gas resources available to support some of this data center investment growth. So you avoid some of the need to invest in the transmission grid and the need to invest in the gas grid to be able to, so two of the biggest bottlenecks to be able to power some of the data centers.
Right. So it's really all hands on deck here, where the innovations are not only coming from an exploration of behind the meter power from the data centers, but the utilities are also rewriting rules that haven't been rewritten for 100 years. What does this mean for, what does the data center boom mean for renewable developers? Does it help them? Does it hurt renewable developers?
Yeah, I mean, the data center boom is incredibly important and incredibly helpful for renewable energy developers. The OBBBA, the bill passed in Congress this year, is taking away the subsidies for renewable energy. And if it were not for the data center demand, the outlook for renewable energy would be much bleaker with those subsidies going away. So when there was a policy effort to decarbonize, a lot of renewables investment was not about meeting demand growth. It was about replacing existing sources of generation. And you have to have very, very low costs to replace something that doesn't have to be built, that's already existing. But now the competition for renewables is not so much about decarbonization. Renewables investment is being made to support demand growth. And, even without subsidies, or I shouldn't even say even, I mean, without subsidies, because of how expensive it's become to build new gas-fired generation, renewable energy is incredibly competitive and has a really, really important role in kind of mitigating the cost of being able to serve all of this demand growth. And so the data center demand growth is a very, very important driver of what's a positive outlook for renewable energy investment.
Yeah, and I think it can be counterintuitive for those that really care about the energy transition to think of it as actually this energy addition, this willingness to pay for new power can help accelerate cost reductions, cost savings that can be achieved through economies of scale for renewable energy, but specifically related to renewable energy innovations that haven't yet really taken a hold on the market and help drive down those costs, such that when we're ready to make an investment to replace a piece of equipment, it's at a cost low enough where we're capable of doing so and justifying that investment.
Yeah, and there's innovation happening in transmission. And there's grid enhancing technologies that, enable you to get a lot more capacity out of the existing system. Things like dynamic line rating or, the ability to change the topology of the grid almost in real time to mitigate congestion. And, utilities have not exactly been enthusiastic about embracing those type of technologies because they would much rather, because they don't make more money when they embrace those technologies, and they would rather build transmission plants or new transmission lines. But now that they're dealing with all of these cost pressures, and now that they're dealing with trying to find ways to bring new demand online, if they can find a way to get more capacity out of the existing transmission system, that accelerates the timeline for bringing new capacity online. So they're starting to look at these technologies, and that's actually a really good thing for renewable energy because it can help reduce congestion that exists on the grid today and accelerate investment in renewables the same way it accelerates the pace at which you can bring new demand online. So a lot of other, kind of likely side benefits for the renewable energy industry.
Is the innovation on the transmission and distribution sector happening in the regulated markets as well as the wires-only utilities within the deregulated markets?
Yeah, it is happening in both places. Dominion Energy, their service territory is the data center capital of the world in Northern Virginia. They're an example, and they're in PJM. They're one of the examples of companies that are deploying technologies like this now.
Excellent. And so when you're thinking about your conversations with utilities and renewable energy developers in the U.S., what do you think is the one thing that renewable energy developers are getting wrong about this demand boom? What is the biggest misconception?
The renewable energy industry, the independent power industry, really revs up their state lobbying organizations to pay attention to how these rules of procurement are written so that they're not precluded from being able to serve this load. And so it creates opportunities for them. That's message one. And message number two is you really need to think about who the end customer is. Like, you really need to think about how is this going to change the utility system, and what is the configuration of resources that I need to bring to them to best help them meet their objectives in serving these new customers cost competitively and with environmental attributes that they want, which is also important to them in many cases.
So as we wrap up here, I think that piece of advice is really excellent, that we're seeing traction in both deregulated and vertically integrated regulated markets. There needs to be a bit of an adaptation from the utilities themselves on how to make this fair for the ratepayer. But there also needs to be an adaptation from the power, especially renewable developers themselves, on how to coordinate not only with the regulated and deregulated markets, but also
how they think about seizing opportunities in the regulated markets and what their policy and lobbying positions need to be.
Yes, absolutely. Because if there's anything that I've learned from this call, it's that there is just so much complexity to the conversation about data centers. It is not just about energy. It's also about politics. It can even be about community pushback, which we didn't even speak about. But it goes really it's full circle from the people that are asking for the energy, for the AI, for the chatbots, all the way back to the consumer when it comes time to pay their electricity bill for what they were doing before AI really made its way into your common household.
Yeah, exactly. I've worked in the power business for 30 years. This Christmas was the first time, maybe outside of the Enron crisis, that everybody wanted to talk to me about my work at the family holiday gathering.
Yeah, they all brought their electricity bills for you to decipher and read through.
Yeah, they're all in central Pennsylvania, where a lot of this data center activity is happening.
Well, fortunately, there hasn't been a dull moment for you throughout your career.
Yeah.
The unprecedented scale that we're seeing from these data centers, as you put it, Chris, you put it very well, it's taken the utility and developer industry, the energy industry as a whole, by surprise, basically back to where we were when post-World War II, there were all of these large load industrial demands on the grid. Now we're looking at large loads in a very similar manner, the scale of these facilities coming on where the demand is moving more quickly than the power can move to meet it. And you've mentioned some really interesting points regarding how regulated and deregulated markets both need to innovate on how they're going to interact with these large load demands, chip manufacturing, data centers alike, and reflect it as a cost and a risk, whether it be to the data center or to the ratepayer, in a way that is fair and that will be supported such that this demand can proceed. As we wrap up here, what do you want listeners to think about as we navigate through this transformation and this anticipation for utilities and developers to be changing their strategies?
This is a precursor of something that's really big. Like, this is a precursor to how this is going to be the century of electricity. And right now, it's about AI. And it's about getting online manufacturing demand. But if you look at the long-term trends and things like robotics and electric vehicles, this is just the beginning of the demand growth that this industry is going to have to deal with. And so I kind of step back from this and I look at, the next 5 years as this period of really remarkable transformation that's going to have to take place within an industry that has to come with an aim, not just for how are we dealing with these problems right now, but how are we going to develop a system that helps meet economic affordability goals, powers the industries that are critical to the future welfare of mankind, and do it all in a way that's also sustainable. So it's, I sit back and look at this and I just say, this is a really, really exciting period of time. This is not just about solving today's problems. It's really setting the stage for kind of what the next 20 to 30 years is going to look like. And it's not just all going to be about AI and data centers.
Very optimistic wrap up there, Chris. That leaves me a lot to look forward to in my own career. Thank you very much for coming on the show and breaking down the complications of this huge issue and what we have as a following generation to look forward to.
Thank you very much for having me, Bridget. Happy to come back anytime. Great chatting with you.
Thanks, Chris. And if you, listener, enjoyed this episode, feel free to follow our conversations wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Bridget Van Dorsten. Thank you again for listening, and see you next time.